Okay, so this is Chapter 4, Pedigree Analysis in Human Genetics. Let's get started on this. Okay, human pedigrees. We talked a little bit about this in Chapter 3, or the Chapter 3 video, and the use of pedigrees is an important method for analyzing the inheritance of traits in human populations. They've been utilized for many decades now, and it's an opportunity for genetic counselors to take a look at family history and look at traits to identify who may potentially have a particular characteristic or disease, for instance, if that's what you're looking at. So, analysis of pedigrees using knowledge of Mendelian principles allow us to determine whether the trait has a dominant or recessive pattern of inheritance, determines whether the gene in question is located on an X or Y chromosome or it's on an autosome, and also allows us to use this information to predict risk for individuals. There are multiple types of patterns of inheritance, and patterns in the pedigree are used to determine how a trait is inherited. It could be autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive, Y-linked, or mitochondrial inheritance. So we'll take a look at each of these real briefly. Okay, software programs. This is a little bit dated now, but there are software programs that can actually be utilized to help put pedigree charts together. They're more sophisticated than what this diagram here shows, but they certainly are utilized still to this day. Okay, and keep in mind that pedigree construction and analysis is basic, or are basic methods. Oop, click too fast. Are basic methods in human genetics. So pedigree analysis proceeds in several steps. First, you have to rule out patterns of inheritance that are inconsistent with the pedigree. If only one pattern of inheritance is consistent with the pedigree, it is as accepted as the pattern for that trait. If more than one pattern is consistent with the pedigree, which one is expected to be more likely? And if it's due to small sample size, it is impossible to choose among patterns of inheritance. The inclusion of more family members may be necessary. Okay, if we look at autosomal recessive traits, characteristics of autosomal recessive traits are for rare traits, most affected individuals will have unaffected parents. All children of affected parents will be affected. The risk of an affected child with heterozygous parents is 25%, and the trait is expressed in both males and females. So here's a picture of an autosomal recessive inheritance, and you can go ahead and probably take a look at this. Um, Again, in these pedigrees, most affected individuals have normal parents. There's a 25% that a child of heterozygotes will be affected, and both sexes are affected in roughly equal numbers. And here are some traits that are controlled by autosomal recessive traits or single genes. So you can see some probably fairly recognizable names like albinism and cystic fibrosis, phenylketonuria, which is PKU, galactosemia, sickle cell, thalassemia, perhaps Tay-Sachs disease. These are things that you might be familiar with. Okay, for instance, cystic fibrosis is autosomal recessive. It's a fatal recessive genetic disorder associated with abnormal secretions of the exocrine glands. Organ systems are affected by cystic fibrosis. For instance, cystic fibrosis, I have a hard time saying that. Cystic fibrosis affects both the upper respiratory tract, like the nose and sinuses, and also the lungs. It creates a sticky mucus which clogs the bronchial tubes in the lungs, and it makes breathing difficult. It can also slow the removal of viruses and bacteria from the respiratory system, resulting in lung infections. The thick mucus blocks the transport of digestive enzymes in the pancreas as well, and the lack of digestive enzymes results in poor nutrition and slow growth. The trapped digestive enzymes gradually break down the pancreas into a fibrous structure, hence the name cystic fibrosis. Okay, the frequency of the gene for cystic fibrosis in the human population to 1 in 25 Americans of European descent, 1 in 46 Americans of Hispanic descent, 1 in 65 African Americans, and 1 in 250 Asian Americans. The cystic fibrosis protein is a membrane protein. The CFTR protein is located on the plasma membrane of the cell. It regulates movement of chloride ions in water across the cell membrane. The regulatory region controls the activity of the CFTR molecule in response to signals from inside the cell. In most cases, which is about 70%, the protein's defective in binding to region 1. Now, exploring genetics, was Noah an albino? Noah's flesh, according to the book of Enoch the prophet, was white as snow. So the phenotype, there's a lack of pigmentation. And inheritance of albinism, there's an autosomal recessive trait. Normal heterozygous parents may be closely related, and homozygous recessive offspring could be albino. And there's more information on this, I think, in the insert in the chapter 4 in the textbook, so you can read a little bit more about this on Noah and potentially being albino. Okay, autosomal dominant traits. Characteristics of autosomal dominant traits. Heterozygotes have an abnormal phenotype. Every affected individual has at least one affected parent, except in traits with high mutation rates. If an affected individual is heterozygous and has an unaffected mate, each child has a 50% chance of being affected. Two affected individuals can have an unaffected child, and usually an affected family member in each generation. Here are some autosomal dominant traits. Achondroplasia is probably familiar to you. We generally refer to it as dwarfism, or it's one of the causes of dwarfism. Brachydactyly, malformed hands with shortened fingers. Go through here. Familial hypercholesterolemia, elevated levels of cholesterol predisposes to plaque formation. Cardiac disease may be the most prevalent genetic disease. Huntington disease, progressive degeneration of nervous system and dementia, early death. Marfan syndrome, connective tissue defect, and death by aortic rupture. This is what an autosomal dominant trait looks like with a pedigree chart. And a pedigree for an autosomal dominant trait will show many of the characteristics of autosomal dominant inheritance. Affected individuals have at least one affected parent. About one half of the children who have one affected parent are affected, and both sexes are affected with roughly equal frequency, and affected parents can have unaffected children. Okay, Marfan syndrome, which is a type of autosomal dominant trait. It's an autosomal dominant genetic disorder that affects the skeletal system, cardiovascular system, and eyes. Individuals are tall, thin, with long arms and legs. They have thin fingers and generally have heart defects. Marfan syndrome weakens connective tissue around the base of the aorta. You can see the enlarged size right here. And this is a diagram of the heart and its major blood vessels. So oxygen-rich blood is pumped from the lungs to the left side of the heart. And from there, the blood's going to go through the aorta to all the parts of the body. In Marfan syndrome, defective connective tissue causes the base of the aorta to enlarge, which can rupture and it can cause death. Okay, sex-linked inheritance. Genes on sex chromosomes have a distinct pattern of inheritance. Males that are XY, they have an X and Y chromosome, pass their X chromosome to all of their daughters but none of their sons. Females who are XX pass an X chromosome to all of their children. Most genes on the X chromosome are not on the Y chromosome. So males carrying an X-linked recessive allele express the recessive phenotype. Okay, the human X chromosome on the left and the Y chromosome on the right side. The Y is much smaller. The false color scanning electron micrograph shown above shows the differences between these chromosomes. Most genes on the X chromosome are not on the Y. Again, this can give rise to unique patterns of inheritance for genes on the X and Y chromosomes. So here's X and Y. For instance, the male on the top will produce an XY chromosome, right? So the female will produce XX. So if you cross them, you get half female, half male. In X-linked sex traits, patterns of inheritance that result from genes located on the X chromosome. And in Y-linked, you have patterns of inheritance that result from genes located only on the Y chromosome. Hemizygous means a gene present on the X chromosome that is expressed in males in both recessive and dominant conditions. X-linked dominant traits can be quite a rare inheritance pattern. Affected males produce all affected daughters and no affected sons. A heterozygous affected female will transmit the trait to half of her children. Sons and daughters will be equally affected, and on average, twice as many daughters as sons are affected. So this is the pedigree of an X-linked dominant trait. Again, affected males will produce all affected daughters and no affected sons. Affected females transmit the trait to roughly half the children. Males and females equally affected, and overall, twice as many females as males are affected with the trait. X-linked recessive traits affect males more than females because males are hemizygous for genes on the X chromosome. Affected males receive the mutant X-linked allele from their mother and transmit it to all of their daughters but not to their sons. Daughters of affected males are usually heterozygous. Sons of heterozygous females have a 50% chance of being affected, and hemizygous males, where it's only on one X, and females homozygous for the allele could be affected. Okay, X-linked recessive trait. This pedigree shows the characteristics of X-linked recessive traits. Hemizygous males are affected and transmit the trait to all of the daughters, who become heterozygous carriers. And phenotypic expression is much more common in males than in females. Here are some X-linked recessive traits. Probably most prominent ones, green blindness and red blindness under colorblindness there. G6P or glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. This is a benign condition that can produce severe, even fatal anemia in the presence of certain foods and drugs. Hemophilia A and B. Ichthyosis, which is a skin disorder causing large dark scales on extremities and trunks. And muscular dystrophy. X-linked recessive trait, colorblindness. Defective color vision caused by reduction or absence of visual pigments. There are three forms. You get red, green, or blue blindness. About 8% of the male population in the U.S. is affected. In the pictures below, those with normal vision see the red leaves, and someone who is red-green colorblind sees the leaves as gray. How do we test for colorblindness? Well, people with normal color vision see the number 29 in this chart that's on the slide. Those who are colorblind cannot see the number. There's a defect in the retina that causes this, in the photoreceptor cells of the retina, the cone cells, which can cause colorblindness. There are two types of light receptor cells. There are rods, which are sensitive to differences in light intensity, and cones, which are sensitive to differences in color. There are three types of cones, which are red sensitive, green sensitive, and blue sensitive. Defects in the cones cause color blindness. There's your cones and rods. Another X-linked recessive trait, muscular dystrophy, a group of genetic diseases associated with a progressive degeneration of muscle tissue. Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy are inherited as X-linked recessive traits, and Duchenne muscular dystrophy affects 1 in 3,500 males in the U.S. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is dystrophin proteins, which are flexible and that normally stabilize the muscle cells during contraction, are defective. Plasma membranes are torn apart during muscle contraction, which causes death of muscle tissue. This is a cross-section of muscles showing the molecular organization within the muscle fiber. In normal muscle, dystrophin provides a flexible and elastic connection between actin and the muscle fiber plasma membrane that helps dissipate the force of muscle contraction. In Duchenne muscular dystrophy, dystrophin is absent, resulting in tearing of the plasma membrane during contraction and the subsequent death of muscle fibers. Paternal inheritance with the Y chromosome. Only males have Y chromosomes, or genes on the Y chromosome are passed directly from father to son. All Y-linked genes are expressed, so males are hemizygous for genes on the Y chromosome. To date, only 36 Y-linked traits have been identified. So what a pedigree for Y-linked traits look like. Again, these traits are transmitted from males to all male offspring in each generation. So non-Mendelian maternal inheritance, like mitochondrial genes. The mitochondria, you may remember from cell structure, they're cytoplasmic organelles that convert energy from food into ATP, which powers cellular functions. They carry DNA for 37 mitochondrial genes. Genetic disorders in mitochondrial DNA are associated with defects in energy conversion. Mitochondria and genetic disorders caused by mutations in mitochondrial genes are maternally inherited. Mitochondria are transmitted from mothers to all their offspring through cytoplasm of the egg. So here is a pedigree showing the pattern of inheritance associated with mitochondrial genes. Both males and females can be affected by mitochondrial disorders, but only females can transmit the traits to their children. Some mitochondrial disorders, let's see here. Probably not as, none of these are probably common. But again, you can read through this list here and see if anything sounds familiar to you. There's the phenotypes listed, so that might perhaps poke your curiosity at some of these particular disorders. Okay, exploring genetics, hemophilia and history. Queen Victoria, if you remember Victoria and Albert, so Queen Victoria and Albert of England passed the Xlinked recessive gene for hemophilia to several of her children. You can see here, here is the Xlinked pedigree for recessive gene for hemophilia to the English royal family, Russian royal family, and to the Spanish royal family. And as you know, the descendant of Queen Victoria was Nicholas, Tsar Alexander of Russia's child, who was a hemophiliac, and of course that brought a lot of turmoil to the last Romanov dynasty, and so the family ended up being exterminated as a result of the Russian Revolution. But you may remember that particular individual as a great grandson, I believe, of Queen Victoria that had the X-linked recessive trait for hemophilia and passed that on to several of her family members. Okay, online catalog of human genetic traits, OMIM. This is a database known as the Online Mendelian Inheritance in Man. It's updated daily and contains information about all known human genetic traits. Each trait's assigned an OMIM number, and there are more than 10,000 entries. Here's a picture of what the website probably used to look like. I'm sure it doesn't look like this anymore. Again, this is a little bit dated. Okay, many factors can affect the pattern of inheritance. Variations in gene expression affect pedigree analysis and assignment of genotypes to members of the pedigree. Several factors can affect gene expression, interactions with other genes in the genotype, interactions between genes and the environment. Phenotypes are often age-related, for example, Huntington disease, and penetrance and expressivity cause variations in phenotype. Penetrance is the probability that the phenotype will appear, and expressivity is the range of phenotypes from a given genotype. Okay, here's an example of incomplete penetrance and variable expression. Camptodactyly, it's a dominant trait where you have immobile, bent little fingers with variable expression. Keep in mind that patterns of gene expression can be influenced by many different environmental factors. Common recessive alleles can produce pedigrees that resemble dominant inheritance. A common autosomal recessive allele can produce a pedigree that looks like an autosomal dominant trait. In generation 1, one parent is homozygous for the type O recessive allele, little I, and the other is heterozygous. In generation 2, two new copies of the little I allele are introduced into the family, which is Roman numeral 2-1 and Roman numeral 2-7, producing 3 little I homozygotes in generation 3. As a result, inheritance of this common autosomal recessive allele produces a pseudo-dominant pedigree, with members of each generation showing the trait and about 1/2 of the offspring in each generation exhibiting the trait. And this slide concludes Chapter 4. Thank you for watching.